Hello, this is Curtis Westbay. This is Module 6 of EDL850 School Law, and I'm going to be succinct this evening. The requirements of the Children's Internet Protection Act are that schools and public libraries must block and filter harmful and obscene content. Additionally, that would include things like child pornography, of course, and they must hold a public hearing regarding their internet safety policy such that the public has the opportunity to ensure that the policy does two things. Number one, ensure monitoring of the online activity of minors, and also include a plan to educate students. And this I'll talk about later, places these institutions in a position where they're not just reactive, they can also be proactive in ensuring the safety of their students and constituents while online. The requirements of COPPA, or the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, at first blush you might think, well, it's geared toward businesses and website hosts, and the law was constructed to make sure that there's no unfair practice for collecting the information of children, that children aren't exploited online, not only in a safety sense, but also in terms of the privacy of their information. It applies to children under the age of 13. I'm going to discuss in a little bit why schools should concern themselves with COPPA, but the gist of it is it's a law that mandates that websites must post a privacy policy. In addition to this, they have to include opportunities for parental consent when children are submitting information like their name, address, their email, even a username that identifies students, especially if the username is simply the student's email. Of course, things like social security numbers. These are all things where parents need to be in the loop so that websites and businesses can't just run roughshod over the spirit of legislation for the protection of children while online for the sake of profit. Then, once they have that information, they need to secure and protect the child's information, and they need to give parents the right to see the information that's been submitted. These two pieces of legislation are both connected to the E-rate program. Now, at first, you might think the CIPA, C-I-P-A, is clearly connected, as schools and libraries have to make a policy, present the policy to the public, and then execute the policy in such a way that they are in compliance with CIPA. But if they do this, there's a big reward, because 20 all the way up to 90% of the funding for telecommunications access, telecommunications equipment, and internet services can be provided by the federal government if schools remain in compliance with this. And though COPPA seems really like it concerns businesses and websites, we must remember that teachers are mandatory reporters. And in the verbiage of COPPA, whenever students enter into a situation where it's made clear to a teacher that they are at risk of their information being exposed or exploited, that is a situation under which teachers should act in their capacity as mandatory reporters. So they need to report relevant information about student online activity to their administrators so that the administrators can act accordingly and inform law enforcement if necessary. There are pretty severe consequences for not following guidelines, not the least of which is that students may develop poor or dangerous habits, or that a culture in which cyberbullying is tolerated can flourish. But in a more transactional sense, E-rate funding could be halted, thereby crippling the bottom line for schools that depend on this funding, especially in urban or rural areas. And, of course, teachers, the district administrators might assume legal culpability if students see content that places them in danger. this is at the very heart of this legislation. My school's policy. What policy? There really is no policy. And I'm in China, so of course Kippa and Kappa don't really apply to me here. And I'm a private school, so they really don't apply to me here. But there's, at the heart of these pieces of legislation, a lot of good ideas. And here there's a social media called WeChat, and children are always engaged. The culture is ubiquitous, and it places us in a reactive position. Now, we've had some instances of cyberbullying. We have a protocol for response, but there's not much of a proactive effort. Usually when things like this happen, we have a full investigation, parent meetings that follow up, and an address of the abuse directly with the students, but there's no education on the front end, and that's probably why we tend to experience a crisis of cyberbullying several times a year, in my experience. Given that there's no valid policy, I should draft a policy in really 3 phases: the education that we would give students, the response to incidents, and the concrete consequences that parents and families can expect if abuse does occur in regard to cyberbullying. Additionally, we should be proactive in programming for parents. Many of them are new to the challenges of being a parent, and they could benefit from the experience of teachers and administrators with dealing with students while they interact online. Once that policy is drafted, we need to come up with an education policy for students, discuss it in an open forum so that parents can weigh in, and it needs to be differentiated between early childhood, primary, and secondary levels at our school because there are different considerations for each. That is my presentation. I welcome your input, whether you do it in the Google Plus community or you would like to discreetly send me an email. I do welcome your feedback. Thanks for listening.